Hello, I'm Scott Goins at McNeese State University. This is a YouTube primarily for my comparative mythology class, and of course anybody's free to listen to it. This is an attempt to try to make some of the Old Testament, especially in the first 5 books called the Pentateuch, the 5 scrolls, to draw some connections between it and some other Near Eastern mythology. And my students have read the Epic of Gilgamesh and will know some of that. First of all, for people who are Christians, just wanted to point out there are obviously several different ways of looking at particularly the early parts of the Old Testament. Some people will see it literally and believe in a literal flood and things like that. Others who are Christians will see the stories as mostly symbolic, an attempt to try to start displaying who God is. Others, of course, will see it primarily as, naive or maybe cute stories where people are attempting to talk about the nature of their people and of their God, but of course not take it as having any ultimate truth. So you can put yourself on any spectrum there, and I would not, of course, try to say which part of the spectrum you should be in. So whatever you want to do. The first 5 books, the Pentateuch, traditionally were seen as being written by Moses. Most scholars nowadays, I would think, would say they were not written by Moses, nor were they written by one person. They're probably a combination of different sources. There was a guy, I believe that this was in the 1830s, named Wellhausen, Wellhausen, who came up with something called the documentary hypothesis, where he posited different sources in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And he posited different sources that some editor or editors put together at some point. And the documents are identified to a great extent by the name used for God. And so you can find this on Wikipedia or many different things. I am looking at Wikipedia. The earliest one, according to Wellhausen, was the Yahwist, and that's based on using Yahweh as a name for God. In King James Bible, it's translated as Jehovah. Okay, people are familiar with that. The other 3 are the Elohist, where they use Elohim for God, the Deuteronomist, primarily the book of Deuteronomy, and the priestly sources, which are post-exilic after the exile to Babylon, I believe. And so, again, that's been refined a lot in the last 50 years or so. I believe Wellhausen thought that the Yahweh source was the oldest and maybe dated back to the 900s, which would be maybe the time of David, but some contemporary authors, scholars rather, have suggested it's much later, so I'm not an expert enough to know about that. But just be aware that there is a general scholarly consensus that the first 5 books and additional actually material comes from different sources, so probably not written down by one person, although who knows, we weren't there. So this will perhaps help us understand the first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis, where you have a couple of different views of primeval history, creation. The first one, according to Wellhausen, I believe is from the Priestley account, and that's the one that's really famous to us. In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth was without form and void, etc., etc., etc. You have a great emphasis on the grandeur of God. God creates things ex nihilo, from nothing, presumably, and it's by His word. It is not very anthropomorphic, okay? Anthropomorphic, remember, means having human form, human similarities in attitude, so being human-like. Anthropos, of course, in Greek means mankind, okay? And so this is a grand, rather sophisticated view, maybe a little more sophisticated, and this is primarily the first chapter, where God creates everything. But then in chapter 2, we move to perhaps a second view where you have God addressed as Yahweh Elohim. So this is a combination kind of the Yahwist and the Elohist. And so in this one, this one's also really familiar to most people. You have, I would say, a much more anthropomorphic view of God. You again have Him creating the world, but now we specifically have the Adam and Eve story. It's not just mankind being vaguely made, but you have these people here, and they are, of course, planted in Eden. Those some of you might remember in Gilgamesh, the story of Utnapishtim in that kind of paradise-like area, and perhaps there's some connection there. And so God, of course, creates Adam, and again, rather anthropomorphically, kind of looks like he's, okay, let's find somebody to help out Adam to be his friend. Nothing works, and so he creates woman from man, obviously explaining why men and women are so similar. You know, obviously the same species, right? So maybe a little different too. And this would be what we call an etiology. That's spelled Etiology. A story that explains something, you know, why are women like men? I mean, I guess it was fairly obvious, but this story would explain it. And you have etiologies galore as this story progresses. So in chapter 3, you have this snake, the serpent, who was probably not at this time identified with Satan, maybe just a sneaky little snake, but of course later on much identified with Satan, and some of you might be familiar with how John Milton develops this story in Paradise Lost. C.S. Lewis also has in one of his space trilogies, I believe it's Paralandra is the name of it, a kind of modern day retelling of that story. And so, you know, very, very influential story. And so, for whatever reason, God said, you can eat whatever you want to in the garden, but there is a limit. You cannot eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Hebrew, know means experience, among other things. They'll often use the term, and so knew his wife so-and-so. And so it implies an intimate acquaintance with, not just like knowing a story or knowing your multiplication tables. And so perhaps the implication is having a real connection with what is evil in addition to what is good. or perhaps it represents mankind determining for himself what is good and bad, rather than relying on God. In any case, it seems to be an admonition to humans not to be entirely self-reliant, not to be autonomous, and of course they break that rule, but they are tricked into it. So it's not entirely their fault, but I guess mostly their fault. They were pretty stupid. And so the serpent, of course, says, I hear you can't eat this fruit, and he catches Eve, and Eve says, yeah, we can eat the fruit, but we can't eat from this tree. And of course, the serpent makes it sound like God is trying to keep them from something that's good, which is not the case, but Eve is fairly easily persuaded, and then she persuades her husband to follow along with her, and that creates a whole host of problems over on in the 3rd chapter. We have these, I guess you would say, curses against the serpent. The serpent is told that he will eat dirt, and he will crawl on his belly, and there will be enmity between him and the woman, and he or his descendants will strike. The women and their descendants will strike at your head, and you shall strike at their heel. Okay, and so a little explanation for, among other things, why snakes crawl on the ground, why they're creepy, why they're scary, why we don't like them. To the woman, he says, I will cause you to have labor and childbearing. He had also said to Adam and Eve that they will be mortal now, they will be able to die. And the humans, the guys, are cursed by having the land no longer grow easily for them. So they're going to be struggling to grow things. Okay. So again, a rather interesting, perhaps profound examination of why we have all these problems. Why do you have to work so hard to do stuff? Why, if you have a yard, my yard's always getting out of control, and why do all the little trees and the brambles and all that and the weeds grow up really fast, whereas you try to grow some flowers or something and they don't do as well. And so that gives an explanation for that. Why is childbirth difficult? Okay, so these are all etiologies. And so Adam and Eve are kicked out of Eden, and they've lost that closeness with God. God comes to them and says, where are you? And not just in a literal sense, sort of, what you doing? But really, you could interpret it as saying, what on earth are you doing? They're hiding from God, even though they were close to him earlier. They're aware that they're naked now, okay? They had been naked all this time and never thought anything about it. Again, kind of an etiology. Why are humans normally shy about being naked? And they try to cover themselves with the fig leaves, and God takes pity on them and covers them with some skin. But perhaps an implication that things are going to be tough now, because that skin means some animals have to die, I suppose. Especially in the Eastern Church, Christian Church, the garments of skin are significant in that they are interpreted as signs of our mortality, of our separation from God. Remember in the first chapter, I forgot to mention this very important thing, that humans are created in the image and likeness of God. okay, very important in terms of Christianity and Judaism. And so, so again, we see why things have kind of fallen apart. And so Adam and Eve's flub lead on to several different problems. And I've heard it said that, in a sense, the entire Old Testament, which in the Jewish tradition you just call the Hebrew Scriptures, because of course there's not a New Testament, right? So you could say Hebrew Scriptures if you prefer that. But we see first Cain killing his brother Abel. You see the flood. You see the Tower of Babel, or Babel, you can pronounce it either way, where, the tower, they're trying to build this big tower, and it's, again, kind of anthropomorphically written as if God certainly is afraid they'll get out of hand, and that's also an etiology for why there are many languages. And then, so after that, you have Noah and the flood. Now, this one you might remember, the flood story also appears in Epic of Gilgamesh and in some other epics. Actually, in Greek, you see a flood story, Deucalion and Pyrrha in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and there's at least one other version. So, fairly common idea. In this version, God is, I think, more kind and intentional than in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in, oh gosh, there's another, I'm forgetting the name of the other Babylonian epic that has a flood story. Sorry about that. But because in that version, Enlil can't sleep because the humans are too noisy, and so he decides to wipe them out. So this story is a little bit more flattering to God. God sees that humans are evil, and so he says, this didn't go well, and so I'm going to have to wipe them out. But he sees Noah's a good man, so he says, I'll save Noah and his family. And so you have this huge flood. Again, God seems more caring for Noah than, say, in the Greek story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, kind of an afterthought that they are saved, and certainly more flattering view of God than in the Babylonian stories. But still a lot of similarities there. Okay, and so, and I'm leaving out a lot of these genealogies, which would be meant to explain, different peoples in the land. Also meant to illustrate how things devolve, how the world has gotten worse. Because remember, some of these people live hundreds of years, like Methuselah. Remember the oldest Methuselah saying. And after the flood, God says we're going to ratchet down these lives to 120 years. And then, of course, later on, the norm is 70 years, okay? And so the next big turning point is the story of Abraham. And Abraham was incredibly fundamental for the Jews. Remember, Jesus refers to the Pharisees as saying, you're proud of being sons of Abraham. Abraham was maybe on the highest level of all the great Jewish heroes. Of course, you would have to throw in there Moses and then later David, and there are others, but Abraham is a biggie. One of the big ideas you have, and you actually had this with Noah, but especially with Abraham, is the idea of the covenant, where God kind of makes a deal. And in fact, the New Testament and the Old Testament sometimes are called the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So the covenant is God reaching out to mankind, making him an offer, offering him help, God realizing that humans can't do things on their own and they're going to need assistance. I think letting them participate, but also, of course, showing that God's the major player in this situation. You know, maybe think about Michelangelo's picture of God reaching out and Adam's kind of holding his hand barely up there. And so you have then the story of Abraham, who really inexplicably is called out of the area of Mesopotamia. It really was his dad who was first called, and dad dies, and God says to Abraham, come on and start a new country. And of course, he's married to, she's called Sarai at this point. They have a large extended family, including a guy named Lot, who is Abraham's nephew. And Abraham has his weaknesses, which is going to be true lots of time, well, I guess really all the time with these people who are picked by God. And this is going to be a theme that you'll see, I guess, really throughout, at least the early Old Testament, that God will pick people. We don't know why. It's not necessarily that they're great. They seem to maybe have a little extra trust in him. They seem to take him seriously, but they have flaws too. You might remember Abraham twice, these parallel stories. He's in Egypt and he stays with a guy named Ahimelech. And in both those instances, he makes it seem that Sarai is his sister because she's really pretty, and he thinks, oh, these people are going to want to sleep with her and they'll kill me. And so, you know, that's not a very good thing to say about the father of your nation, but that's a point that we're going to see. We may not look at that many stories, but believe me, they're there. And so so he has his flaws. He has his weakness sometimes in trusting God, but overall he's a very generous person. When he and Lot, his nephew, you have two big families here, and the shepherds are quarreling, and so Abraham says, okay, Lot, let's stand here. You choose your side. You go one way, I'll go the other. We'll be friends and allies, but we're going to each have different parts of the land. And so he lets his nephew choose the land that he wants, and Lot chooses this rich-looking land, which is unfortunately not going to be a good place for him to be, but we might or might not get to that today. And so he's, Abraham's very generous, and even after he has this, I guess I wouldn't say it's a spat with Lot, because again, he seems not to be angry, but he saves Lot on one occasion. Lot's conquered by some of these kings, and Abraham, with a fairly small force, goes and secures his safety. Now, Abraham's biggest problem is that he doesn't have a kid. And God promises he will have a kid, but it takes a long time for this promise to be fulfilled. And so in the early in the story, Abraham sleeps with his wife's handmaid, which was apparently I don't want to say common thing, but it was an accepted practice to keep the family line going. You know, if the wife is sterile or seen as being sterile, then the guy sleeps with the handmaid, and the child is accepted as being legitimate, I guess, or at least as a proper heir. And so that's how Ishmael is born, but that doesn't work out. And so finally Isaac is born as the true child of Abraham and Sarai. And Sarai now becomes known as Sarah, the mother of many nations. This is all predicted by Abraham's guests who come to him in really famous story. Abraham's sitting there and he sees these guests, and in some traditions it's viewed as the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Abraham welcomes them, and you see this nice version of hospitality, which was very important in this age. Also with the Greeks, if you're into classics, you'll know about xenia, right? And so Abraham drops everything, welcomes them, and they say, "Yeah, you're gonna have a kid." And you also see that same hospitality, but not in a very nice way, in the story of Lot. I'm trying to find that chapter here. Lot. This is. Sorry here. Yeah, this is. And my eyes are going bad here. This is chapter 18. Really fun little story in some ways, where God says to Abraham, or God's saying to himself first, well, gosh, I gotta tell Abraham what I'm gonna do. And what God has planned is to destroy the city where Lot lives, Sodom. It was seen as being an immoral city, Sodom and Gomorrah, very famously immoral. And Abraham tries to make a deal with God, and it's a cute little story. He says, well, if we can find 50 people who are good, will you save the city? And God said, yeah. And Abraham goes on and whittles it down to 10, but apparently there still aren't even 10 people who are in the city who are good. So the angels do go to save Lot and his family, but rather famously, the people of Sodom, try to rape the angels. Don't do that at home, and the angels end up blinding them. But in the interim, Lot actually, and it's really a repulsive idea, but it shows the importance of hospitality. That the guys out in the street say, "Hey, give us those angels. We want to have sex with angels." Well, they don't know they're angels, of course. Give us those guys. Lot, since he's welcomed them as his guest, says, "No, you can't have them. Take my daughters instead." And of course, the angels quickly put an end to all that nonsense, and the city is destroyed. Lot's wife, rather famously, turns into a pillar of salt. They had all been told, don't look back. Obviously symbolic that, don't look back to this old life, this old city where people were horrible. There's no evidence, I don't think, that Lot was engaged in any substantial immorality, but the city did, and Lot's wife looks back when she's not supposed to. Again, probably symbolic of saying, "Oh, I'll miss old Sodom." They had nice garage sales or whatever, so she's turned into a pillar of salt. But anyway, the story, things are successful except for to Lot's wife. Isaac is born to Abraham. There's a very famous story later when Isaac's apparently a good bit older, of God testing Abraham and asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but in the last minute he substitutes a sheep. And this is somewhat like the sacrifice of Iphigenia in Greek mythology. Some of you might know that story. And so Isaac lives, and that's, of course, how the Jewish people will come into being. They're the descendants of Isaac. And that's as far as I think I ask everybody to read. So we'll stop there. I will do a little video on the first few books of Exodus, and maybe on Daniel. That was our other little assignment, was I think Exodus 1 through 14, and then the book of Daniel, or the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. So if anybody else is watching this, of course, you're welcome to tune into that.